Hello everyone, I'm Professor DK and welcome back to another episode of the Simple Login App series. Now, in the previous episode, we completed with the registration activity and we were able to add a user using the registration activity. And as you can see here, although I am able to enter the user credentials and login into the app, once I close the app and again try to open it back again, you'll notice that the same credentials don't work. So the details that we enter are not saved across sessions. So as you can see, it says incorrect credentials at the bottom. So this is the flaw in our design right now, and the only way that we can solve this is by having some kind of a storage on our phone as a kind of an offline database where we'll be able to store the credentials and be able to use it as persistent storage. So that way, whenever we open the app, we'll have those details already stored and the user will be able to enter the app easily. And this is going to improve the user experience as well. So let us see how we can implement this today. So Android provides something called shared preferences, which you can use to save data across these sessions. And by sessions, I mean that when you close the app and open it back again, you need to be able to have that data stored already. So the way you do it is using shared preferences. And shared preferences, you can imagine it to be a file which is stored on your phone. And the way it is stored is in an XML format. And for those of you who do not know what an XML format is, so you have already seen that in Android Studio and probably you don't remember it, that's all. So if you go over to resources and then values and probably open up the colors.xml file. So I think this is like the simplest example to understand how XML works. So the way a file in XML format is stored is you have these key value pairs, and here for now you can just forget about the root element, which is resources. Just look at these three values here, and you can see that here you have the key, which is color name, right? So this is the key for this particular color, and the key is color primary, and this is the value that you store for this particular color. And again, similarly, you have the key as color primary dark, and this is the value that you store. So as you can see here in XML format, we have these data which are stored as key value pairs. And to put it simply, this is nothing but a dictionary. And as you would see in a dictionary, you have these words and then you have their own meaning. So that is how it is stored in XML format, and that is what shared preferences does. Shared preferences will create a file on your phone, and let's say you are adding the credentials there. So you could probably say username and then the value, which is Dheeraj in this case, and then password 1 up to 8. So that would be your other field, right? So this is how shared preferences works. And so let's see how we can implement the same today. So the first thing you will do is you'll go over to registration activity, because that's where the values should get stored, right? That is where we start with creating the credentials for the users, and when the registration button is clicked, you want to save those details. So go over to registration activity and we'll start by creating the shared preferences, the object for that. So as you can see, when I typed in shared preferences, it imported that particular package for me here. But in case you don't see it, so let's say I just remove it, and then in case you don't see it, you can always press Alt Enter, and that package will get imported here. All right, so let's call our variable as shared preferences, and here you'll notice that the S is not capitalized, it's in lowercase. Okay, and the next thing you'll need is shared preferences editor, and this is nothing but a class which basically allows you to add values into the file. So shared preferences dot editor, and let's call this shared preferences editor. Note the spelling here, and it's in lowercase, the S is in lowercase, so we'll call it the shared preferences editor. So once the variables are created, you'll need a file, right? And you'll need to name that particular file. So the way you do it is you use shared preferences, the variable, and then you do get application context, and that is to get the application you're in, and then you can do get shared preferences, and you can see here that it expects a string and then it requires a mode. Okay, So let's look into what that is. And name, let's call it as credentials database, so credentials DB. And for mode, we have a couple of modes, and the mode that we will use is mode private. Okay, and the reason for this is mode private basically allows the data which is in the app to be used only by the app. And if you want the data to be used by other apps, then you can use the other modes. But then mode private is the more secure mode that allows you to just have the data restricted to your app usage itself. So we'll use mode private here. And for the editor, you need to say shared preferences dot edit. And when you do that, when you say shared preferences dot edit, it's gonna give an editor back as a return argument, and that is basically stored in the shared preferences editor variable. Okay, so we have created our file, and the file name is going to be shared credentials DB, which is going to get stored on our phone. And we have our editor, which is going to allow us to add values to this particular file in an XML format. And now you must be asking me, so what kind of values can you put in this file, right? So you can either put a string, you can put an int value, or you could put a float, or even a boolean. So these are the permitted types, and you can easily add the data to the file using the editor. And you just say put string, put boolean. So as you can see here, it lists all the different options that you have. So put string, put boolean, put float, and all of the parameters, as you can see, it's a key value pair. And the key in itself remains the same because it's going to be a string, but then based on what option you choose here. So if it's a string, then the other parameter is going to be a string. If it's a boolean, then you'll have to enter a boolean as a second parameter. So that's how it is. It's a simple key value pair scheme that is being used by the shared preferences editor. Okay, so you'll only want to add values into this particular file once the registration is successful, right? So let's go into the eregister.set onClick listener. All right, and here once the validation is complete, and once we know that okay, all the data that has been entered is okay, like the way we need. So basically we are validating it to see if it's more than 8 characters, right? So once the validation is complete, what you can do is before starting the new activity, you can just so as you can see, we are inside the if loop here, and we are basically going to store the credentials at this point. Okay, so for that we'll use shared preferences editor, and as I mentioned, you can use so many options that we have, but in this case, since both are strings, you will do a put string. Okay, so for the username, we'll just call the key as username, and we're going to give the value as the user. So not user, it's the registered username, and same for the password as well. So put string, we have, let's call this key as the password, and then we're going to say registered password. Okay, so we have basically now created 2 different key value pairs, username and password, and we have given the values as the registered username and the registered password. And you have still not added these particular key value pairs into the file, and to do that you need to have this particular line of code, which is apply. Okay, so when you call shared preferences editor.apply, all the key value pairs that you just created are going to get committed into the file, and all the changes are going to get stored into that file. Okay, so this is a very key line, and if you don't have this particular line, then it's not going to work. So remember that this is a very important line, and it commits the changes and adds them to the file. All right, so now we are done with the registration activity itself. So we have added these lines of code, and now so even though now we have created the new user, let's say you have closed the app and you have opened it back up again. So what should happen is the app should be able to check if a file called credentials DB exists, right? And if the file exists, that's when you're going to retrieve the value. So for that, you need to go back to main activity, and here again you will need to create the shared preferences again. So here you will create a shared preferences variable. Now note that although you have the same variable here and also in this particular file also, note that they are all within the class. So by default they are private, so you cannot access them. So this is not the same as the variable that we created in the main activity. So these are different variables, And although you could also, call this as public static and then use the same variable in main activity, you could do that. But then note that, get shared preferences function is an abstract function, right? And by abstract, I mean that, so all the activities can implement that function and they will have the same copy of shared preferences, because finally we'll be, using the same parameters called credentials DB, right? So it's going to finally check if a credentials DB file exists on the phone. And if it exists, we're going to retrieve the value from that file. And since the file remains the same, it doesn't matter how many variables you create, finally you're going to get the same value. So it's just a copy that you're creating here as well. So you have shared preferences, and we don't need the editor because we are not going to add anything. We are just going to retrieve value. So you can just forget about the editor for now. So we have the variable created, and again we're going to do the same thing. So shared preferences is equal to get application context dot get shared preferences. And as I mentioned, since we are going to use the same file, so you're going to say credentials DB, if I can type it properly, and then for the mode we are going to say mode private, okay, so that it the file can be used only by the app itself. Okay, all right, so we have the shared preferences variable which has the value stored in credentials DB. Now, when the app starts, you simply cannot, retrieve values from credentials DB, because let's say the user has not registered anything, right? So then the file itself is not created, because the file gets created only in the registration activity. So in case you try to access something from a file which does not exist, it's going to throw an error. So a file check is necessary. So for that, you're going to say if shared preferences is not equal to null, that means it exists, then only you're going to retrieve the value, right? So you're going to retrieve the value of the username and the password. So let's call it as saved username, just to make it more simple to understand what values we're retrieving actually. So this is the saved username that we're retrieving, and we're going to use shared preferences dot get string because we have saved it as a string, and we need to pass the same key that we created. So it was username, if you remember. So it was username and password. This is the key. In case you enter a different key, then it does not exist and it's not going to give you a value. And the next parameter in getString is what is the default value in case that particular key does not exist. So let's say this username does not exist. So what value should I give you, right? So the default value will be null. So it's an empty string basically. So we are going to pass empty string here and username here. And in case username does not exist, it's going to give you null, basically an empty string, so that the user themselves will need to enter the username and password. So string saved password is equal to shared preferences dot get string, and again here it's password and the default is an empty string. Okay, so once we have retrieved the values of the username and password, we'll need to add it to the credentials. Now if you remember from the last video, so we are basically creating the credentials in the registration activity, right? So if you go to registration activity, you will notice that we have the credentials variable set up here as public static, so that we can access it across all the activities. And then once the register button is clicked, so here we are creating the new credentials, right? But note that this is the registration activity, and in main activity, which is the first activity that runs, so you do not have the object already created, right? So the constructor is not actually created unless the user goes into the registration activity. So what you need to do here is, in case the username and the password already exist, so you're going to create the object yourself. So your credentials, you're going to call the constructor itself. So you're going to say new credentials, and then you're going to pass in the username and the password. Okay, so this is basically going to create the credentials for you based on the value that has been stored in the file. Now in case the user goes into the registration activity and then changes the username and the password, or basically creates a new user and password, you will be basically getting that particular username and password the next time the app runs, because again in registration activity, when you create a new user in the same key, username and the password, you have different values. So here again we have a different constraint, which is basically right now the app only allows for single user logins, and in the next episode I'm going to show you how you can have multiple username and passwords you can store. But in this case right now we can only have one username and password, because that's how it's the app is designed for now, and which is obviously it's not what you want, but so we are basically going step by step, and you're learning a new thing in every video. So by the end of this series, you will have gained a lot of knowledge, and you'll have a fully functional app which has covered on all of these flaws that we have, and it'll be a completely closed design. So bear with me, and at the end of the series, you will have a fully functional app. All right. So here, as I mentioned, so you will be creating your credentials, and these credentials are basically being used in the validate function. All right. So at this point, you can go ahead and run the app. So I have one more feature that I would want to add on top of the app right now, and I'll show you that after that. But at this point, yeah, you can go ahead and run the app and check if you are able to, create a new user using registration activity, close the app, and then, run the app and see if those particular users that you created, are getting retrieved and it's allowing you to enter the app or not. Okay. So for those of you who have played gaming applications, the simplest way for basically storing data like the high score or the progress made by the user in the app is to use shared preferences. And although note that today all the games that are there out there, they basically use an online database. So what we're learning today is an offline database, which is getting stored on the phone itself. So these are not like the modern designs that are there out there, but this is something for a simple user who will want to store something on the phone of some kind of progress on the app itself. So this is about the offline database, how you can create it. So what we're going to do now is, if you see when I open the app, the username and the password fields here, right? So not the activity registration, I have opened up the wrong file. Yeah, so activity main.xml. So you can see here that when I open up the app right now, the username and the password, they are not entered by default. So let's say that I already have the username and password already. So I have created a user. So I do not want the user to get into the app and each time be prompted to add the username and password. So I just want to open the app, and then the username and the password should be loaded by default, and the user should be just allowed to click on login and just enter the app, right? So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a simple field, and that's going to be remember me. So I think most of you would have seen this on the app. So for that, you're going to go to the buttons widget here in the palette, and then you're going to drag in the checkbox field and you're going to add it here. Okay. So once you add it, it's slightly difficult to see, I guess, but okay, let me see if I can. Okay, so yeah, what you need to do is constrain this particular, okay, once I've zoomed in, okay, so constrain this particular widget. So to login button here, the bottom one goes to the top of the login button, and the top of the checkbox go to the edit enter password field here, and the right and left you are constraining it to the parent layout itself. Okay, so once you have constrained it, let's move the login button just some pixels below, and then you can have the checkbox here right in the middle of enter password and login. Okay, so let's change the name of the checkbox to remember me. And what remember me checkbox is going to do is, if this particular checkbox is checked, then basically the username and password is loaded by default, and the user is not prompted to enter that again. Okay, so that's the basic idea of what I'm going to do there, and click enter and you should see the text change. And we're going to change the ID of this particular widget to checkbox. So let's say CB, and we're going to call this as CB remember me, and you're going to click on enter. Okay, so this is the ID that we've created, and now we are going to go into the main activity, and again, yeah, follow the drill. So we have the checkbox here, so checkbox, and in case you don't have it, if you get an error here, just click on alt enter and that package will be imported, and then we can call this as, so since it's an element in the UI, so I'm going to prefix it with an E, and I'm going to call it as E remember me probably. Okay, so E remember me is the name of that particular checkbox variable, and I'm going to bind it with the XML layout using the find view by ID. So E remember me is equal to find view by ID r.id.cb remember me. All right. Okay, so now that we have created the variable, note that so the remember me is a field that you'll need to store across sessions, right? So if the remember me checkbox is checked for the app, then basically when you again open the app, then the app needs to know if the remember me field was checked or not the last time. So you will need to add it into shared preferences. And so for that, what you can do is whenever the login button is clicked, right? So you can basically say that, you know, I want to save the username and the password into the file, so that the next time I come in, then it is saved. So for that, you will need the shared preference editors. I forgot about that. So shared preferences dot editor, and again, call it as the shared preferences editor. And after the shared preferences variable gets initialized, so we can just call in shared preference editor is equal to shared preferences dot edit. So this is kind of a revision for those of you who are typing it again, so that you don't forget, right? So we have done this already, we are doing it again. And once we get into the else here, so the else is nothing but login was successful, right? So only when the login was successful, you're going to save the username and the password. So shared preferences editor dot okay, sorry, I have it as capital S, that's why I was not, so shared preference editor, it's lowercase s here, dot here you're going to do put boolean, right? So remember me is a checkbox, and the checkbox only has two values, 0 or 1, so it's a boolean. So I'm going to use put boolean, and probably we can say remember me checkbox. You need to know how you are writing the string name, because it is case sensitive and all that. So remember how you are typing it here, and put boolean, and by default, so what you're going to do is check if the box was clicked or not. So the second parameter here is basically if the box is checked or not, right? So for that, you can just do E remember me, and you're going to use the function is checked. Okay, the is checked function is going to return true or false, basically based on if the box was checked or not. Okay, so we have added the value here. So when the user clicks on login, it's going to check if remember me box was clicked or not, and it has added it here. And the next time you come in, right, so that's here, this particular piece of code. So the next time, which is basically if the file was created already, then what we're going to do is, let me just add it here. So here you will check if the box was checked the previous time or not, right? So for that, we're going to do shared preferences dot get boolean, and you'll need to pass the key. And the easiest way to avoid any errors is just to copy paste, so that you type it properly and there are no mistakes. And as I mentioned, when you're retrieving any value, it asks you for a default value, right? And the default value is false. Okay, let's give it that, because we don't want it to be true. We are setting it as false because by default, the remember me checkbox is going to be false, right? So we have passed it as false. And if the remember me checkbox is true, so this is going to return true, right? So if this exists, it's going to return true, because that's the value that will be passed here if the box was checked. So if it's true, then what we're going to do is we are going to set the username, so which is ename dot set text. So we are going to set the username element on the UI with the saved username. Okay, so that's simple. Okay, and same goes for password again. So ePassword dot set text, and here we're going to pass in saved password. So although we have completed the code, I've actually done an error, and I don't know if you have spotted it. Okay, so now that we have loaded the username and the password fields, note that you'll also need to set the value of the remember me checkbox, right? So if it was true, then basically you will need to set eRememberMe.isChecked. So that particular field, sorry, not isChecked, set checked, and we're going to say true. All right. By default, it is false, so you need not worry about that. The other case, you need not create an else loop here. So by default, it is false. And yeah, if in case it is, we have this particular remember me checkbox true in the credentials DBs, then you basically check it. All right. So now, although I have completed everything, I actually missed out on a critical thing that I explained in the registration activity, and that is, if you do not apply the changes, then it's not going to work. So make sure you add this important line of code called shared preferences.apply, and only then the remember me checkbox is going to work. Okay. So yeah, at this point you can go ahead and run the app, and you should see everything working. So here you'll notice that only when the login button is clicked, that's when we are storing the value stored in the remember me checkbox. Now you could also set an on-click listener on the remember me checkbox as well. So whenever you just click on the box, whenever the value changes, so you can just change the boolean values in the shared preferences file. So you can do that as well. So yeah, I mean I can just show that too. So in case you do not want it here, you're just going to do Control X, and then you could also have it here as part of another on-click listener. So you can do eRemember me.set on-click listener, new on-click listener, and inside this you can basically paste the shared preferences editor code that you have written already. Okay. So here what happens is, irrespective of you clicking on login or not, if the remember me checkbox is it's toggled, so whenever the change happens, so whenever you click on it, it's gonna save that value into that particular file in the key remember me checkbox. I think this is a better design, but then yeah, it's totally up to you how you want the app to be designed. So yeah, I've just shown you both ways, and it's up to you on how you want the app to work. So yeah, at this point you can go ahead and run the app and make sure that everything is working fine. Okay, so I have the app running here. So if I open up the app, so you can see here that I'll show you that the username and password are not yet stored. So 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. So Dheeraj 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. So the user is not yet created. So if I click on login, so you can see that the attempts counter is reducing and it says incorrect credentials. So I'm going to create a new user. So I'm going to add the password here and click on register. So registration was successful. So this means that now we have added the username and the password into a file on the phone, and now I should be able to log in. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. So I'm clicking login. You can see that the login is successful. But the most important thing is having the data saved across sessions, right? So that is what we wanted. So I'm going to close the app. I'm going to open it back up again, and you can see that here it again expects me to add the username and the password, and this is because the remember me field was still not added, was checked the previous time. So here I've added the username and credentials, and I'm going to click on login. So you can see that since we already had created the user the previous time, it was stored in a file. So that way it is retrieving that data and it's allowing us to get into the app. Okay, so you can see that that works. Now let's check if the remember me field is working. So I'm going to click on this particular checkbox and I'm going to close the app. I'm going to open it back up again, and you can see that now the username and the password are loaded by default. Okay, so in case now I uncheck that box, and then I'm going to close the app, and again I'm going to open it up. So you can see that now the username and password are not loaded by default, right? And in case for those of you who are using the previous design where the remember me field, the value gets checked into the file only after you press login, then make sure that you add the username and then click on login only after you click on remember me. Okay, so do that and click on login, so that way it gets stored, right? Otherwise it does not get stored. So it's up to you totally. You can either add the on-click listener on the remember me checkbox or also on the login, so up to you. So I've showed you both, and right now as you can see, even if I create a new user, so let's say I create a new user called John, and if I give him a new password, so 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9, I'm going to register that user, and you can see here that it gets loaded because remember me field was checked. All right, and this is getting retrieved from that file that we created, so that's why the name has changed. But one thing you'll notice that, okay, now I'm able to log in, all that is great, but if I go back to the previous user that I created, so Dheeraj, and it was 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8, and I'm going to click on login, and that doesn't work because we have the support for only one user right now, because we have the username and password as the only fields in the shared preferences file. So the value gets updated based on the new user that you're creating, but it does not create a different set of key value pairs for a new user. So we will see how we can do that using hash maps in the next video, which is going to allow you to add multiple user logins. Okay, so as I told you that there is a file which gets created when you use shared preferences on the phone, right? And the way you see that is, now let's say you close your app, right? And then if you click on the app info, now this is on the OnePlus. So for those of you who do not have OnePlus, you may not actually see this option here. You might have to go into settings, into the app settings of the login application or whatever the name you have kept for your app. And then if you go into the settings, you should basically be able to see the storage and cache details there. And when you create a shared preferences, so it basically creates a file, and this gets added to the storage in your app. And that is why you see that here there is user data, which is 57.34 KB, which gets added. And this some part of it might be because of the shared preferences file that you created. And let's see, if we delete this particular storage, does the app actually retain the data or not? Okay, so just to confirm that we are actually storing something, the app is actually storing something, let's delete all the data that the app is storing. You will see that everything is 0 right now. And if I open up the app, you'll notice that it no longer has that particular data. Basically the file itself got deleted, and that's why there is nothing here. Now in case, let's create a new user. And as I told you already, when you create a new user, it's gonna write into a file and create that file. So now let me just go into the app settings, and let me just refresh it again. So now again, you can see that the user data and the cache, there is some storage basically because of the file that gets added. Now there is no way that you can actually see that file, the XML file that I told you about on the phone itself. But in case you want to actually view that file, you can do it in Android Studio. And Android Studio has a very good interface that it provides for this. So here at the bottom, you should notice this particular tab here called the Device File Explorer. And I think if you do not have it here, probably you should find it somewhere under systems, something like that. But you can go ahead and search on Google where that particular window is. But it should be here. And when you click on this tab, make sure that you have your phone connected firstly, because all the files what you see here are only displayed if you have your phone connected. So connect your phone via USB, and then go into the data folder. Okay, so if you go into the data folder and under app, you should under data, go into the data folder, and you will need to go into the folder of your particular application. And the package is basically the application name that you have. So com.example.login application. So I'm going to search for that in this particular window here. And once I find it, I'm then gonna go into the shared preferences. So there's a folder called shared preferences, and if you open that, here you'll notice that there is a file called credentialsdb.xml. So this is the file that we actually created. So there's one more file called embryo.xml, and that has a couple of stuff needed for the app to run, and that's not something that you have created. But credentialsdb is the XML shared preferences file that we created. And if you double click on that, you will basically get whatever is stored, and you will see that I have the username and password stored right now. And let me just go ahead and check the box for remember me as well. And after that, and I'm just going to close the app. I'm going to open it back up again, and I'm going to click on credentialsdb again. and you can see that now I have the boolean of remember me checkbox as well. And as I mentioned, it is all going to be a key value pair. So if it's a boolean, it's going to be called boolean name, and this is the key, and this is the value. So this is how it gets stored. Okay, so I think this gives you an overall picture of even the app, how it runs, how it retrieves the data, and how it actually stores this particular data in your phone. Okay, if you like this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up, and also do not forget to use the comment section below to let me know what could be improved or what you liked about this video, and definitely I'll try to incorporate all the feedback into the next video. And definitely do not forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the bell notification icon so that you can get notified whenever a new video comes out. So thank you guys for watching, and until the next video, happy learning.